My name is Bill Wyman, and what I'd like to do at the first is, at our first time together, is tell you what the topic is. That first of all. Give you a moment to think about it, find out who you are as a group, what you hope to get from this experience today, and because we're having a wide open dialogue with me. This isn't a lecture, it's a dialogue. I have ideas that I would like to share with you, but this is about as much about you sharing with me and us having a dialogue about the future of the denomination, actually, and the future of the ministries of the denomination, as it is me trying to just share something with you. So how many persons here are pastors in a church? Lay persons in a church? Chairmen of finance and trustee committees in their church? Yeah. How many persons here are on a conference board? Conference board. We have, I'll just describe this. When you first saw this title for this event, which is Legacy Strategy, Real Property Transition, what did you think when you saw that title? What did you think, was the first thing that came into your mind when you saw that title and what attracted you to come here? I don't want you to leave without me writing down why you came here, so I can hopefully find an answer for you about what it was. This is where you tell me.
Best way to handle a closed church.
Closed church. Well, that is absolutely accurate. One of the principal concerns over the next 20 years will be some churches that will no longer exist they may exist as a body, but they may not exist as a site any longer in the way they are now configured. This church right here, I guess, is somewhat of an example of that where we are. They just moved. I guess somebody's told me the story about they had to relocate part of this church from one place to another. So the kind of transitions that are going to occur is what I'm here to talk about. Anyone else have some other ideas that they... Yes, ma'am.
I've thought about how we as district superintendents, or the several of us who are here, have had to frame the conversations about properties and assets and about their intended purpose and their use in perpetuity and what it means to make those transitions, because people are so invested in brick and mortar, and how we try to frame them.
Yeah, the one thing to think about is how to frame the conversation around the brick and mortar of a current church and its facilities. So that's a big. How many persons are district superintendents? I don't guess I know y'all. I met you the other day. 3 of y'all, 4 of y'all. So while we're getting started on this, I'll just share with you some of my background. I went to the University of Texas. I'm from Texas. I hope you won't hold that against me. I don't think any of our teams have beaten any of your teams lately, so that'll be okay. I'm not predicting the future may hold that, but So I went to the University of Texas. I did business for 10 years, and during that period of time, had the heart strangely warmed experience. I'll just say it to you that way. At home, one noontime, prayed the prayer to commit my life to Christ and all that I was doing. But always raised a United Methodist. We opened a church in our barn. Being from Texas, you can imagine you'd have a barn every once in a while. But after that, I still did some more business for a while and felt called to ministry, went to a 4-point charge. On that 4-point charge, Wyndham, Dodge City, Lannius, and Hale, one of my friends says I'm the only reverend he knows that will admit he was appointed to Hale. You know. So, but I learned more about stewardship from those persons who earned their living from the soil of North Texas than I could ever have hoped for otherwise. It was a wonderfully growing experience for me. And saw the hands of Jesus at work there, and that weren't on the end of the statue. They were out there in the hands of the persons. It was a marvelous experience. Had an opportunity then to serve at a large urban church in Dallas, Texas, which is located on the campus at SMU, and was there for about about 4 or 5 years. The bishop of the time, Bishop McFerrin Stowe, called me one day and said, we need an ordained finance person, and that's what I was, to be the financial officer at the Methodist Foundation in Austin, Texas. So I'm following the lead of my superintendent and bishop, right? Y'all know about that, how you follow that.
Amen.
Yes, sir. There you go. So we moved to Austin and located in Austin, Texas, where we served for 6 years as financial officer at that foundation. In October of a year, my superintendent, Joe Washington, called me, said, we need a financial officer at the Board of Global Ministries to be treasurer of World Mission and UMCOR. You know what UMCOR is. So we felt led to do that at the leading of our superintendent at the time. And it was a wonderful transition. I learned more about the mission, the valuable mission of the church at Global Ministries than I could ever hope for otherwise. And UMCOR, just being their treasurer was a good experience. I was fortunate enough then to be called to have an opportunity to go to Western North Carolina, where I was conference treasurer for about 19 years. So that's my history up until this point. I'm sharing that with you because I've either had or been a part of every level of financial management of the church that exists, really, from a local church, being a local pastor, to World Missions and a local conference. So I have a lot of experience. So if you do have some question during the time that we're going to have our dialogue today, I wish you'd just ask me that. And if I don't know the answer to it or know something about it, I feel like I do know someone that would know something about it. And so I'd help you with that. What we want to talk about today, during that little time, did anyone come up with another thing they'd hope to get out of today? Yes, ma'am.
I'm coming from a lead church that has just merged with 2 other churches.
Okay.
And we're deciding with the district supervisor and others how best to utilize the campuses, or do we sell them? And what does that look like?
Well, that is a marvelous question. That fits right in with point 6. I should Actually, I should say point 8. I want to have one more than the bishop. No, that's a joke. That was a cheap joke. So the question really was, when you have a merged church, what do you do with the campuses that are a result of the merger? So, and how best to use those resources? And I believe that is a perfect question for this experience. Our time together today is about legacy strategy that flows from property management and property transition. I'm calling it property transition rather than calling it sale of property. I'm just admitting that from the very first moment. Selling of property has such a commercial aspect, flavor to it, the words. I like transition better. I'm currently involved with the conference where I used to work in the transition of about 25 different pieces of property. So, and during my career there, it was 19 years, we probably transitioned it more than that. So there's quite a bit of that going on. Now, what I thought of when I thought about Florida, I thought, well, you probably have a different kind of revival going on here because everybody, when they're 65, moves to Florida.
Not since the recession.
Not since the recession. But so you may have a different demographic. I don't know that. I think that's probably not true that you have a different demographic, but you do have persons continually populating the state, and the state is growing, and where northern states and north central states may not be growing. So you do have a growing population, but what I think from reading and listening to persons like Lovett Weems, who's written that book, Focus, and I hope you all have read that book, and have taken his thoughts to heart, because what he believes is, and what he has proposed to us is that over the next 20 years, the demographics of the United Methodist Church, not from a lack of evangelistic zeal, but just from the demographic characteristics of our church, there will be a lot less of us than there are in this year, just because the average church member is probably now in their 60s, and possibly younger members are not repopulating the church. He says in one of his contentions is what we should focus on is not net gain or loss of members year over year. He says what we should focus on is first-time professions of faith as a number that's replenishing the body of Christ in every church. I'm not going to get into a lot of preaching about body of Christ and that, but I just wanted to say that in the local church, rather than looking at net gain all the time, what I think he is suggesting we would focus on is new professions of faith coming into the church, whether or not they're equal to or greater than deaths or transfers out or any of the other. He believes that there's going to be a net loss of members. So the question is, what is happening on the other side of that net loss? And it's not, there will always be some negative years. What will happen? So what I'm suggesting to you is that over the next 20 years, and I think right now is the time to begin to set the strategy. What will be the strategy for a conference? What will be the strategy for a conference when it begins to focus on the resources that become available from churches that no longer exist in a building and may no longer exist as a community? There are going to be properties, and there are going to be resources that are going to be available to the conference itself, and how best to approach, what is the best stewardship approach to that prospect over the next 20 years, which I think he believes will begin in the year 2018. This is now 2013. So from 2013 to 2018, we have some time to prepare a strategy. So what I'm going to suggest to you today is that we define a strategy. And what I think that the strategy will be, and I hope we can do this together, is that we produce, or you produce, or across the whole denomination produces a measure of viability. A measure of viability. And that measure of viability be what we support, what the church supports from the resources that come from churches that no longer exist. I'm assuming here that I drank the Kool-Aid. I'll say that. You know what that means? I'm believing what Dr. Lovett Weems says when he says that demographics are going to take us to a place. And I'm just saying I believe in that. We can have a lot of evangelical fervor. Our evangelical fervor is going to replace the congregation over time, but it will be very difficult to replace it 100%. So my point is, this is going to come to you. It is going to come to the United Methodist Church, not necessarily just to you. It is going to come to the United Methodist Church. It is going to come to you. You can either plan for it to come and have a strategy to deal with it, or you can not plan, and it probably won't be dealt with excellent stewardship. What do I mean by that? I have to give illustrations, it's the only way I can talk. For over 120 years in the conference I just worked for, there have been at least 150 different churches closed for various reasons. And the practice at the time was similar to your practice that you just said, if a church closed for whatever reason, they would just say, and let's just use some generic names, St. Paul and St. Barnabas. How's that? That's a couple of people we know. St. Paul and St. Barnabas. Let's say St. Barnabas had to close, and they'd just call up the trustees at St. Paul and say, now, St. Paul, take care of St. Barnabas' property for us. Was that your practice? I'm assuming that was your practice here. Well, you know, you had the trustees of St. Paul's may or may not be able to take care of that other church and its property and that resource. So when we had our archivists go through all of the archives of the conference for over 100 years and give us the names of every closed church, and we went to every county to see what the status of the properties was, we discovered there were still 150 churches that bore the name Methodist Church, but were no longer in existence. And they were in various states of repair. What kind of states of repair? Well, some of them had open wells. Some of them were being used by Baptists. Oh, those Baptists. That's humor. That was humor. Probably y'all's grandmothers were Baptists. I'm sorry. So one of them had a oil tank leak, and we had to hire the HEPA company to come to a certain town in western North Carolina to clean up the HEPA oil tank leak. Another, well, I could just go on and on with the condition of those properties. So we started a systematic approach of trying to transition those properties into the hands of someone who could use them. Our cemeteries left over from those days were in terrible condition. I don't know how many cemeteries you have, but the Western North Carolina Conference has about 500 cemeteries or more attached to its churches. Well, you probably would, on that score, you'd probably have 300 or so. I don't know how many you'd have. And so one of the things we want to respect when we talk about our churches is we want to respect the resource that's in that building and in that parsonage, but we want to respect those families that have interred their heritage in that site. So when it starts coming to you, I don't know how you're doing it now, but when it starts coming to you, if you have a strategy that a church no longer exists, what is your strategy for dealing with that? I'm suggesting that that we would work together on creating some ideas about that. So first of all, what is the strategy for setting a viable church measurement? That's what I think your strategy should begin with. Which churches are viable and which ones aren't, and start recognizing those as a superintendent, Ms. Austin. I would just say trying to create a strategy around what is a viable congregation, what is a viable church setting, and starting to measure that in the year 13 and back. You could go back, you know, to the year 03, 93, 83, and choose what metrics you're going to use to measure the viability of the group and start attending to those. Now, I'm just going to use you an example. I actually don't know you. I'm Bill Wyman.
Elisa Rushing.
Lisa, okay. Well, Elisa's church here has just merged with 2 other churches. So someone used some concept that, I don't know the name of your church. Anona. What is it, an apple?
Yep.
I just learned that yesterday. So this church, Anona Church, someone determined that Anona Church was a viable church because it was going to be able to merge with 2 other churches. I may be totally wrong on this, but I'm just going with it. Someone determined Anona Church was viable for whatever reason and merged 2 other churches with it. Members, some came, some didn't, just how that works. And now Anona has a decision what to do. I'm suggesting that a methodology or a metric be posed by a group here in your conference as to which churches you consider are viable, and those are the ones that are going to be considered for long-term support. in a different way than has probably ever been done before. Our church has always supported equitable comp. We have all sorts of congregational development grants, but I don't know that anyone's ever focused those kind of things based on viability as much as they've been based on need. So where do you want to invest the resources that flow from these properties? That's the question from me to you. And I'm suggesting that you could develop a criteria for viability and apply that across 700 churches. So if you do that and you do it with and you engage, what I'm saying here, if you create some critical performance variables, that's the word I wrote on this piece of paper, and you challenge persons who are in charge at the various spots they're in, and they know what these variables are, they'll work to each one be viable. I know that. Or you'd think they might. They do the best they can. And I don't believe that viable means large. Viable may not mean large. Let's just have a talk about what viable really means. We have a historical criteria where I'm in my previous work of how much churches spend from their statistical tables on various things. How much they spend on apportionments, how much they spend on the pastor, how much they spend on program, how much they spend on staff, how much they spend on the building and debt. So we can measure those from way back to 1973, you have all that statistical information, to 2001 to 2010. And there are certain benchmarks that can be derived from those statistics. So I'm suggesting to you that a piece of your strategy could be to create what you would consider to be a viable model for a church with under 49 in worship on Sunday, or a viable model for a church with over 500 in worship on Sunday, or a viable model for 149 to 220 to 250. And because, as Dr. Weems points out, a lot of churches that have arrived at 200 on Sunday got there from 500 on Sunday, not from 50 on Sunday. You see what I mean? So when you create these criteria, that'll be helpful, I believe, in your choosing your pathway. When you create these criteria, you want to measure over time who's moving from which category to which category, and what, if anything, they're having to invest in their plant, primarily, or if they are investing in their plant, versus if it is a true statement that money follows mission, and the hardest kind of thing to do is maintain the plant in the new generation, then we're going to want to think in terms of viability being someone who's producing money for missional work that would be attractive to these new professions of faith over time. That's the concept. I can't make it's impossible for me to make a viability judgment for you. You have to do that for yourself. But I think if you would choose to start in a pathway of creating a concept of viability, there's going to be some churches that are so viable. I don't know the name of any of your counties. What's a county that's 40 miles from here and 6 miles from the interstate? Goldsboro? Hillsboro. Out in Hillsboro, wherever that is, I don't know. But it's 40 miles from here and 6 miles from the interstate. Orange County. There are churches in Orange County that are so viable. They have 38 on Sunday, but 12 of them are under 15 years old because it's a critical family ministry in the middle of a rural community that y'all have never even been to. But it is so viable and so vital for that community. They'd make the cut. I mean, they'd be the one that got a check mark. That's one we want to watch after. There's a particular church in the former conference where I worked in the lower end of Anson County, which see doesn't mean anything to you all either. They used to have attendance of 150. Now they have attendance of about 50. However, of those 50, 14 of them are school-aged children. And in their youth group, they have maybe 65 or 70 kids in their youth group, some of which their parents aren't in the church yet, I'd say. Because it is a great evangelistic effort in that part of that county by a church that was basically on its way to lights out. I'm not trying to be crass, who's turned itself around. I don't know if y'all don't have access to Duke Endowment here in this state, but in North Carolina there's a thing called Duke Endowment, which is a great benefit to our rural churches. That church has turned itself around enough that they now are able to get a grant from Duke Endowment to sort of remodel part of their world, because their church is coming back to life. Because they're recreating that base. They're resetting the base. That's what Lovett Williams wants to talk about all the time, resetting the baseline and replenishing the congregation with new professions of faith. That's where they're headed out in that church. And it's exciting. It's exciting for them. So they'd be one that you'd pick. That's viable now. They're viable out there. Here's what's not viable, in my view. You have a church or a congregation. It used to be 500. Now it's made its way to 200 and it's on the way to 50. It is poor. Now, this will be a judgment, but I'll give it. It's poor stewardship to let that $1 million building hang on till the 3 people who are still attending worship walk out the door. You get what I'm talking about? That's poor stewardship. That is the worst kind of stewardship. That is a waste of all the energy, ties, and efforts of the men and women who worshiped there for 100 years. How would I know about that? Because in the city of Greensboro, 1 block from a shopping mall, 2 block and a half from the interstate, the Methodist Conference up there had a church with, I'd say, at least 24,000 square feet of worship, not worship space, 24,000 square feet of space, 2 stories, chapel, sanctuary. Well, they kept hanging on, and it just never, it went, like I said, from 500 to 200 to got down to about 37, and they finally decided they couldn't keep it up anymore. Well, what had happened during that period of time that building that initially cost around $2.25, maybe even $2.5 million at the time they built it? What happened during that time? Well, they couldn't repair the stormwater drain system, the runoff. They couldn't repair that. They couldn't repair it. So underneath the education building and all the way out through the parking lot out there, it was all deteriorated and begun to sink. So I could give like 3 other things that had happened wrong with that building, but my point is that had it been recognized much earlier and with some criteria that made sense, the members and membership and energies of that church that had existed on that site for 75 years could have merged with Anona. Could have. Maybe Anona would have moved over there. I don't know. But someone could have taken charge of that with a different mindset and a different strategy. And instead of us transitioning that property that was probably $2.5 million or more We did transition that out for $825,000. It's not bad, you know. Nona, that wouldn't be bad for one of those two sites you have, be worth $825,000. But my point is, it might have been so much more well utilized if someone had taken a little different strategy and had a strategy and gotten away had a strategy and gotten away from whatever personalities might have been involved. You know what I'm talking about when I say personalities get involved? Often a rumor will go through the conference. The conference is planning on doing this. Y'all know what I'm talking about, do you? You two? A rumor will go out through the conference that certain things going to happen. And then the superintendents have to fight that rumor down every time they make a phone call. You know. So my point is, actually, point one of our entire talk is, if you would take time to establish a viability study, and your minds put together some thoughts around it, where you're going to focus your resources. And it's not all on First Methodist Church of Orlando or some other place y'all could name that's got a couple thousand coming on Sunday, but it could be just anywhere, Hillsboro, whatever these places. You'll find places there that will be ministries for mission. And if you have an opportunity to assist in the transition of the legacy, I believe it's an important legacy for a church to give itself to another church. This is a stumbling block. This is a stumbling block because you have to assess what is the commitment. I wrote this down. How committed are our churches to helping one another? It's really a bigger vision than just me and my Sunday school class if I'm in the church. So what is the vision for the churches to help one another? They either will or they won't. Now these two that you're with, I don't know what happened there, but
It was a 5-year, 6-year, come along beside until they got to the point where they were willing, one in particular, to sacrifice their property in order to further the kingdom.
okay. Well, it took 5 or 6 years. I guess that's the reason I'd like to talk about this in the year 2013, because if you take the Levitt Williams concept, there'll be more activity like this occurring out here in the year 18, 19, 20, up through 25, 30, 2030. So if we plan for it, and you plan for it now, the benefit to the conference and to all the viable churches is, there's a great resource. I don't know what the total value of all the real property in your conference is, but up there in that other conference where I'm around, it's over $2 billion. And you have an insurance program here, which is greatly helpful to you for understanding all these concepts. I don't know if there's any insurance people here or not, but you have a denominational leading insurance program in this conference. The big churches tried to model it, and they can't. New England did a good job. They did model pretty good. But big churches tried to model it, and they can't do it. You have the premier. It's all about your leadership here, putting that together. So, the way to start that, I wrote, is the last item on here is face-to-face interaction with your superintendent's core is the only way to begin that conversation if you were to decide what's viable and what's not. If you set out the viability goals, everybody's going to strive for them. Well, I don't know that, but many will strive for them. Maybe the whole 700 will be viable. Yay-hoo for that, right? That'd be good. But it's not likely. So let's plan for the change. Point two. Point two is, what is your responsibility? Your responsibility is for prudence and care. This only takes about 2 sentences. A fiduciary person is given 2 responsibilities: the responsibility of care and the responsibility of loyalty. Loyalty means I won't be a part of a group and get any of the proceeds for myself. In other words, I won't be dishonest. And the second part is, I'll be a caring person for these assets that come into my responsibility. I'll care for them. They used to call it the prudent man rule, but that was before 2008. There weren't any men in New York financial world in 2008, I can promise you that, because there's not a prudent one among them. The only prudent person I knew in 2008 was the woman who was in charge of the FDIC. She stood up for accountability. Can't even remember her name. She just wrote a book. Sheila Blair. Thank you. But anyway, that was my joke on the prudent man rule. But anyway, so the concept is that you have two responsibilities. One, the responsibility of loyalty. The other, responsibility of care. The responsibility of care means you'll apply a prudent person rule to all decisions. When I say you, I'm talking about you as the conference, and actually you as the trustees of your conference. It would be good and helpful now to begin to practice those, which you probably already are, but begin to practice and make sure that your leadership understands loyalty and care. And those are the only two principles you need to have in your mind. What do they relate to? Loyalty and care relates to the Methodist Church is not a real estate investment trust. Okay? Methodist Church has a lot of real estate, and it's 700 congregations here, and the ones that I was with up there. But it's not about being a real estate investor. It is about being a prudent steward of the resources of all the community. I'm saying that because oftentimes what you hear is, and you could hear this at Anona with these other two properties. I've just got you on my radar. I'm sorry, ma'am, but that's just the way it is.
We're ready.
Whenever it comes time to transition a piece of real property, there will always be, if you're not careful, they're always going to tell you it's worth more than it is. Or someone will get involved in the conversation. How can that property only be $110,000? I know it's $200,000. Well, and the person telling you that may or may not really. You don't know what is. You don't know what the basis for their opinion is. So I'm suggesting that whenever you have these occasions, you don't regard this property. You can take the prudent person rule at its best. This is how I would act if this were mine and I was doing it on behalf of me and my family. And the way I would do it is I would dispose of it and transition it at a reasonable rate, at a reasonable value. Because the Methodist Church is not about owning real property. Methodist Church is about winning people to Christ. That's what the Methodist Church is about. It's about doing the mission. So just owning property, carrying property over years is not what about the Methodist Church is about. So what you would want to effect there is you'd want to effect a transition that makes sense. And then what would you do with the resources that flow from that? Well, you have a lot of choices, but I'm suggesting you would have clear principles that would guide you. Number one, the principle would be the best value is the value you can get at the time. That's the best value. Because waiting around is not going to help. That may or may not be true in the last year and a half. Traditionally, waiting around is not going to help. The reason it's not going to help is because if you respect the property and really respect it and all parts of it, you're going to maintain it. You have these two properties over there right now. It's fixing to be springtime. If you don't keep the air conditioning on in those buildings and the water turned off and the yard mowed, and clean out the gutters, I'm just making stuff up now, every day you own it, it's going to be worth less. And it's going to be worth 3% less every year that you don't maintain it, because it costs you 3% a year to keep up a piece of property. You own a piece of property that's worth $100,000, you've got to invest $3,000 in it every year in order to keep it be worth $100,000. Doesn't get worth 103, it stays at 100. That's just the way that is. So when we were talking about that church a little while ago that had this building at 24,000 feet and ended up being worth about 800, it just deteriorated over all that long period of time because it wasn't maintained. And they couldn't maintain it. I mean, they're very nice Methodist folks, but they just couldn't maintain it. It just couldn't be maintained. So they needed to make some choices that didn't get made. Second thing is, whenever you have the property that you get into your possession, it is a resource and you have to attend to it. You have to water it and, you know, tend it like a garden. Then it'll come time to sell. Or transition, which is my new word. Transitioning that property needs to be in the hands of a thoughtful strategy. I love every United Methodist real estate agent that I know. And there's one in every congregation, one in every county. They may not be the one to transition that property for you, however. They may not be. That's preaching, isn't it? You know, well, it may not be. But then it might be. But the only way you can address with good stewardship concepts is to have a strategy for how you're going to get it appraised, how you're going to get these two properties appraised, how you're going to control them. We have a company called A. Anthony Company that specializes in maintaining discontinued properties. So, in other words, all these FDIC properties that you see all over, and you know, bank owned, this and that. Well, this company sees after those properties, puts the sign up, changes the locks, winterizes them, that kind of management. We pay them a small fee, pay all the bills on those properties, in case y'all ever get any in the Methodist Foundation. You know, that you get a person like that. Baltimore Washington Conference has a staff member who does nothing but do just what I'm saying right now. That staff member goes around to all the properties that have come to the conference in this way and sees after them. Pays the bills, gets them winterized, has a strategy for transitioning, getting it evaluated, whether you're going to get an appraisal or not get an appraisal. These are just strategies. The next thing is, that's what I call respecting the property. Then transitioning it out is the last piece. The Methodist Church typically is not a landlord. So transitioning this property for cash is the best, most efficient way to do that. I'll give you the same principle. If at your church, let's say, your church, I'm back at Aon again. I'll tell it to you all. I'll tell it to you all. You're the foundation guys. If somebody was to call up your foundation and say, I want to give you, I'm going to assume your answer, so just be with me. I want to give you 10,000 shares of IBM stock, which is worth $450,000. And you'd say, okay, we'll take it. What would you do with that? You'd probably sell it. You would sell it immediately on the day that you got it and invest it according to what? Your strategy for investing your cash in all of the $250 million worth of assets you have. You wouldn't just say, here's my $10,000 of IBM, I need to keep it right now, because well, you haven't made any decision with regard to that. Your strategy is all based on $250 million, not based on $250,000. So I believe that the concept is correct for Aona or anyone else who, I'm so sorry for you. I hope to buy you a Coke someday. I'm just talking to you all the time. if a piece of real property comes to the conference in this way, the rational strategy 90% of the time is to transition it into cash. That's the rational strategy. Cost to hold it. The proceeds can be used as resources for other things. So what are the principles? The principles are, conference is not a real estate investment trust. It's not an investor. It's a mission. When these resources are available, if you have a strategy, what are we going to do with these resources? These resources are going to be used to support or create new viable communities, existing or new viable communities. We've got a 10-year window here to do this in. You have 5 years to think it up, 10 years to implement it. Whenever you have, whenever you do come upon one of these pieces of property, I want to give this as an aside. I wrote an aside about the cemeteries. This is a very important piece of information in the community where this property is located. Is your name Legg?
Yes.
The Legg family, I'm just going to say you do it, whether you do or not. The Legg family has most of their family members buried in the cemetery of the church that the congregation no longer exists, and the property's now in the hands of the conference. Without loving, caring attention on your part to that real property, the Legg family and the Austin family and the Luther family, who've all lived in that community all their lives, it will be hard for them to overcome some negative transition of that property. So what I'm suggesting to you is that you would survey that property, sometimes include the buildings that are there and sometimes not. Survey it and create a cemetery association to be populated by the families of the persons who reside there. Most churches have a cemetery fund attached to a cemetery already. Make sure that money stays intact with that group, so they continue to have their historical family love and caring relationship with that part of the property, and then adequately transition the balance to someone else. Someone asks me all the time.
And would you gift that property then to
Yes, yes, to the cemetery association would be a gift to them, plus whatever cash might be in a cemetery fund within the church, so they could maintain that. Sometimes they don't have it anymore. A lot of them, East Bend, for example, one of the churches on East Bend, well, I'm just saying that, it's a church I know about in North Carolina. One of the churches on that chart, Union or something like that, they spent all the cash they had. They had nothing left to support their cemetery. So the conference created a cemetery association for them, prepared all the legal documents, deeded the property to the families, and attached a cash amount to that group to start an endowment, or not an endowment, to start a fund so they could beginning the maintenance of that property. That's just a practice. And if many of these as you'll have all of them be different. There won't be one, it's not one size fits all. It has to be, there are many pathways that lead toward division, and sound principles is the only thing that will get you through to a positive result. And the principles are respect of the real property, establishment of a viability criteria, and an effective transition. The effective transition being how to care for the property while you have it in your care. Okay, all I've been doing is talking. So, and I thought we were going to dialogue here, but I've been dialoguing with Ms. Iona here. I'm sorry about that. So, What questions would you have for me about all this talk I've been saying?
Bill, back to that scenario of the church in North Carolina that was $1 million parking lot facility. Your comments have mostly been about other churches absorbing or merging with that. What about that congregation selling that property and going to another space?
Right.
If that would be
That could be part of your strategy.
Okay.
Your strategy could be to say, during this 15-year period, one of our strategic pathways, they're all parallel, we're saying, is that particular church could choose to move to another location and transition its real property and use those proceeds to either create another worship space or however it would choose to do. And that would be in whatever the missional setting of that was. You know, I didn't mention this, but if you have a property transition that is in an urban county, we have 7 urban counties in western North Carolina. If you transition a piece of property in there, whatever proceeds from that, whatever resources are there, can only be reinvested in urban property. So that's a disciplinary provision. So whenever you think about that, that's a scenario that attaches to a closed church, but you'd want to think about, whenever you're relocating. We have the merging idea is a genuinely nice idea if you have a church that's capable of receiving the merge. If you don't, just simply merging to be merging may burden both with something that they can't support. So you want to have a lot. We have a church in a county seat town in western North. I can only tell stories. That's all I can do. Church in a county seat town in western North Carolina, a very small urban church, very small in size and number, was discontinued. But this larger church had an outreach mission among homeless population, I would say, in the area where that church was located. Well, it was a perfect match for those two to be together, because now that other church, the smaller church, is used virtually every day of the week for lunch and dinner feeding programs, where members of the big church go to the larger church, go out there and prepare and serve the meals, and it is actually on the interstate, and the other church is in the middle of downtown. So merging is one of the parallel pathways, but you have to have a merging partner that works.
You have to have a lead church.
You do.
Yeah.
Well, yeah.
And there's the book that Nona used in several of the
Mhm.
churches in that district are using is Better Together.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Which, in their analysis, small church mergers don't work. 1 + 1 = 1. In 2-3 years,
Mhm.
220 member churches merge together form in 2 to 3 years 120 member church.
Mhm.
And the ones that seem to be working are the ones like this, where you have a lead dog, big church with healthy DNA, and the smaller churches merge basically are adopted
Mhm.
rather than a merger. It's an adoption, and that tends to work better than the small church mergers, which is the case with the Nona. One of the things, Bob, you mentioned about the going to or allowing a church that's small and struggling to go to sell their property. They've got lots of assets, property assets, and go to another site. I think the district superintendents need to be and districts need to be real careful about allowing that, because if it's a church that doesn't have a particularly good DNA, isn't a very healthy church, has a lot of resources, sitting on a couple of $1 million worth of property, wants to go somewhere else to, kind of just basically waste that money, I think we need to be careful about allowing that.
Mhm. So one of your strategy pieces, your strategy pieces in allowing whenever a church becomes what gets into the category is not really viable the way it is, what's going to be the result of that is a critical care point. It's really a critical care point. There's I have at least 3 illustrations of that very thing.
And perhaps an alternative to that would be a strategy of multi-site with larger churches like Anona, and this merger that we're talking about with Anona actually is establishing a second site of Anona.
Mm-hmm.
They're doing a whole multi-site deal, using the 2 merged churches to help fund that second site. We're looking at another possibility in that district as well, but where rather than using the resources of a church that really doesn't have the kind of critical mass, the healthy DNA, to establish a site somewhere, their resources merge into another church to establish that second site in an area that really needs a church or needs revitalization of church life.
One of our county seat churches has a church that was merged with it that they actually never completed a merger, but they just gave it to its care, and they use they don't use, but the 2 churches cooperate in a way that the band for the contemporary service practices at the other church in a smaller setting, really, basically, until they are comfortable enough to be able to come to the main church and do big worship service in the big church. If you know what I'm talking about, like they have like people that want to be in the worship band. I'm uncomfortable talking about this because our church has this person with the cross and candles and rings bells when they come down the aisle. We don't have that band effect at our church, but the thing about it is that at this one church they do have contemporary worship, probably like they have here, and they have a smaller setting, about 20 miles away, where the members of the worship band to want to be part of that, they play out there at this other church for 6 months or something until they feel like they can be in a part of the big band. So, a lot of different combinations. That's what I'm hoping to say there.
Bill, one of the things that there is a group of people that continue to worship on this site, and what we're pretty much doing is kind of hospicing them through this. One of the options that we looked at was selling the property and moving them and paying for them to worship in another site together. It's a group of about 35 or 40 people.
Mm-hmm.
But it just so happens that the property where it is very viable in what we want to do, the mission that we want to do. But one of the things that we did, they are allowed to continue to worship together and feel really good about it.
Mm-hmm. And so there's every kind of mix of this strategy. Ma'am?
There's a couple things that I was wondering about. Does the Methodist Church as a whole have, or maybe one of the strategies, like a program of what needs to be done when a church needs to close? And not only, I'm the more of the financial, the asset management, what you're talking about, but there's also the emotional side of closing a church for the members of that church and what's going to happen. And then the second issue is, I thought we were restricted by the discipline when we sold a church to only be able to use that for property, plant, and equipment, so to speak. So we couldn't use it for operations.
Well, you wouldn't want to, no.
Right.
You wouldn't want
So
to.
and another thing in the future, what are we gonna do if we have to close all these churches as we're doing the strategic plan? If we have all this money and less property, plant, and equipment, that's restricted.
Yeah, well, hopefully you're going to have a place to put it.
And it doesn't necessarily have to be restricted. The annual conference can vote to allow some of that money to be used for, or all of it to be used for missional purposes, which was the case with some of the money that
Right.
Nat was talking about.
you know, there's going to be some contests around that. Sir?
Yeah, when we talk about viable churches,
Mhm.
like, we had the phenomenon where there, many African-American churches
Mhm.
are located in the inner cities where there's been a lot of change, but there's also a lot of opportunities for outreach and ministry,
Mhm.
feeding ministries, such as the youth ministries. But those very churches, even when people start attending, you know, they're people that don't have money.
Right.
You know, so
Right.
they're not viable financially.
Mhm.
But they're doing what Wesley did.
Right,
That way.
right.
See, so when we start talking about viability, how are we measuring, you know, what viability have to do with the work that's being done, the money that's being raised,
Mhm.
you know, are we talking about, you know, that's, especially in African American churches.
Right. Well, that's part of that strategy that you'd have, in my thinking here, you'd have about 5 years to kind of put that together so you could see what I know of an example of a congregation that's basically ethnic oriented, not African American but another, and it's been in existence for over 100 years or more, even more. That is continually, the Western Methodist Conference up there believes that is a place that is providing a valuable, viable ministry. They're choosing to continue that support there in mission grants and other kinds of grants that keep it going in its mission spot. So, if you have a strategy that includes more than just one point, then you'd be able to address those things over time. That's the reason I don't think viable means large, doesn't mean small, doesn't mean no telling what it means until you all decide what it means yourselves. Did you have a thing?
Yeah, I'm appreciating the conversation, and the purpose of this is just to continue or begin or continue the conversation. I think a couple of thoughts. One is Lovett Weems did some research on our conference, and he noted that some of the large churches are getting larger. Some of the large churches are smaller, and then but the middle size is kind of disappearing.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I think that's generally true in the church in the U.S. The middle-sized church, like the middle-sized business, is kind of disappearing. It's either getting bigger or some niche is getting
Yeah.
smaller. And I appreciate that comment. I think it's not that you confine any church to being a certain size. God does amazing things everywhere. But that, if you look at our apportionments, what used to be sort of a level incline is now more like a steep incline.
Right.
And the larger churches do fund some of the financial viability of the smaller churches through equitable costs. But a part of a strategy would be to not close churches where the resources aren't there, but see how the conference can help that, and where a place needs bivocational ministry.
Yes.
And how nonprofits can be started alongside those churches, maybe in some of those properties. I think there's a lot of room for creativity in the future, but I just appreciate the conversation. I realize this is something people often talk around the edges,
Mhm.
or we deal with one at a time. And I appreciate, hopefully this is just the start, because I feel like, Lovett is right, and it's not a personalizing thing against any person or how hard people are working. It's just the baby boomers and the generation following them. And we're the second oldest state, in the United States. So when Lovett Weems talks about that demographic, it's going to come to us quicker. And we're very multicultural. So to me, that's also the other thing Gary and I were talking about is we often expect immigrant communities to take on these buildings that these Anglos have let decline for 10 years. Okay, now it's yours. So they. I mean, I was in a Nation church in Fort Pierce. So now it's yours. And so they've had a hurricane. And they've had water damage, and so we say, okay. birthday, here's a gift. So, I think, but I
That's true.
appreciate someone just reflecting with us on it from a detached, systematic way of how would you start and how would you go about it, because that's the way we're gonna make better decisions.
Yep.
In the long run, and the end result is we do this so that we'll be positioned to do ministry that's needed in our communities. So I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, because that's exactly I hope that is exactly the point where we would have begun. Our talk today was about establishing some metrics and strategy over time to lead and guide, and you have several years before it becomes even a.
I just wanted to add, following up on the point that was made about viability, financial, that we need to also have conversations regarding values and priorities as an annual conference. Right. The bishop has touched upon multicultural, the fact that that's how communities are increasingly so, but together as a conference, have we discussed that and claimed that as priorities? Because that's going to also impact the criteria that we put in place. Right. And until we do that together, you may have one individual doing this or saying that, and we don't have a consensus overall. So I'm saying, yes, those things need to come in place as well.
Yeah.
I'd like to add that because of the training, the inclusivity training that we've had, we do have the language now that we can use to have these discussions. Because these discussions, multicultural discussions, and the implications for small and big churches and all that, it's got to be had, because a small church, black church in a city can do tremendous work. Can't be a bushman. Can't pay that, because the people that's gonna come in are just as broke as the people that are there. But what is Wesley telling us to do? Collect us to go out and get the work done. And that's a multicultural phenomenon that we really need to have. Right. And I think we have the language now to talk about it.
Having the language to talk about it across everyone in the conference is important. Larger churches, smaller churches, this kind, that kind, whatever kind they are. This future is on its way to you. And if you start thinking about it now, you'll be able to deal with it in Fort Myers or in Tampa or in Hillsborough, or wherever.